All right, so my Speed Geek is on a fairly technical point, but once I explain it to you, I'm actually hoping that this can be a little bit more of a discussion, because I'd really like your views and opinions on this matter, as I think they might differ greatly from the gut reaction most tax litigators have. So my topic is here. Tax morality and principled settlements. Could mediation be used more often in the changing world of tax? So there is a rule in tax litigation that's very different than in other litigations. And this is that you cannot settle unless you have a principled settlement. And a principled settlement is one that is based on law. So I'll try to give you an example. If you have only one issue, you can't just settle on the basis of, okay, well, you win 50% and we'll win 50%. You have to be able to support in law or fact that settlement position. So even on valuations, you need to be able to support with evidence, where are you going to land? And so when it's a question of law, how should the tax law be interpreted? How should it be applied? That is much more difficult in terms of coming up with a settlement. Now, a lot of practitioners, and I've heard, actually, I'll give the judges what I've heard a lot of judges say. A lot of judges have said, well, this is only how get creative, because there's a lot of ways, particularly if you have two issues, or if you have, this shouldn't be a bar to settlement in tax. This shouldn't be a reason for you to push forward on litigation that doesn't need to go to court. So we have this. This is kind of the overarching current state. So now, overlaying that currently, and you could not have missed this in the news, I don't think, we increasingly have these debates and discussions about tax morality. So, for example, the big hot topic right now are the private company rules that were just released, and tax fairness, and fairness for the middle class, and everyone should pay their fair share. So merging those two ideas of tax fairness but also principled settlements, is there a growing role for mediation between taxpayers and the Canada Revenue Agency, especially since these are ongoing relationships? Much like the neighbor dispute, you are never not going to have to file your taxes. You even have to file, first a terminal return when you die. You are never going to get out of filing your taxes. You are always going to have an ongoing relationship with the Canada Revenue Agency and the officers of that agency. So you can imagine where you have taxpayers who think, oh, the Canada Revenue Agency is out to get me. They think everybody's a cheat. And you have Canada Revenue Agency, on the other hand, that thinks, well, everyone I see is. You can have a really difficult time in disputes to come to any sort of settlement, or even just discussions between the two parties. So I'm wondering that with all that background, I'm hoping to do some work on whether or not mediation, or a version of mediation, maybe traditional mediation wouldn't be quite the right fit, but a version of mediation might be possible in this realm. And I'm hoping to do that actually as my major research paper for my master's. So I thought, what better place or time to come and see if anybody because tax lawyers will have the automatic reaction that no, mediation, unless it's factual, mediation doesn't play a role. There isn't a role for mediation. So I'm curious if people who have experience with mediators might see something more there. Is this a misunderstanding of what mediators can do, or? Oh, go ahead.
I'm just going to flag timing.
Yes.
And if you're going to invite people to talk, and they're going to talk on this, they're probably going to need to come up to talk.
Oh, okay. Sorry, you'll have to come up to talk.
Or you'll have to repeat everything. So if you're inviting opinion,
okay,
it might be challenging.
You might have to come up to talk then.
But you now have 3 minutes to
Okay.
invite that.
Okay. Okay.
So, and I guess it's not really questions, it's more comments, right? Is my initial thought is that to the extent that our role as mediators is to help people get better understandings of why positions are being taken and what's important to them in order to be able to understand the fairness of outcomes, I think that mediation can play a really important role in that environment. And also in the context of having a principled settlement, part of that is developing arguments that are based on those underlying interests of the parties, which you would also be able to do in a mediation context and come up with joint arguments that you could use to support an outcome. So those are my thoughts.
Says the lawyer. I had almost the same kind of thoughts framed slightly differently than Jen, but I was just thinking that if you have two sides who both have concepts of how their position is principled, then the space in between can also often be argued as principled. And so if we have somebody, and you're not going to be going to court unless you think you have a pretty good case as a tax lawyer, if both sides believe that their case is valid and held by principles, then the space in between them may be as well. And so that's an interesting space to explore.
That's pretty, isn't it?
That is interesting.
Yeah.
That is interesting. I have to think a little bit more on that, the space in between.
Were you here to hear the quote that you had any?
No, I wasn't. Unfortunately, I walked in right on.
I had a similar situation. I had a business. I had a tax inspector come to my shop and spend 2 days bugging me. And I looked at all this paperwork and I said, look, I don't do this because it takes a lot of time and it's trivial. So I haven't claimed all this money. I've also haven't declared all these things. It all balanced out pretty well. My concern, if I was trying to encourage mediation, has to do with the empowerment of the situation to resolve anything. It wouldn't be much point in going talking if the law wasn't changed. I think it fundamentally had to go to how these decisions are made, and fundamentally it must come from purpose. Like, what is the purpose of collecting tax and why and who pays? And that has to be clear. And then you can, you can rearrange the situation quite a bit. But without that, so that's where I would go with it. I would go with power.
Well, do you think having somebody who, like a mediator, who is who is not on the side of either party, would be useful in explaining that? Because obviously when you have these two parties, they may agree on a number of things, and often they do. So is it useful to have somebody who doesn't have a side in the room to help them see where they agree?
I bet you that in the big picture that's trivial. That you're spending a lot of time without the very clear statement of what the taxes are collected for, who pays. So anyway, that's my feeling from my own experience.
So I'm going to acknowledge that we are actually out of time for Jacqueline, but if we also are early, because everybody's been moving quickly. So if you wanted to step up to that, I think it works.
Excellent.
I just feel rude because I cut everybody else off. So after Suzanne talks, I'm going to invite anybody who has a question for any of the previous speakers who are still here to ask their question.
The topic reminds me of having a discussion about whether in a different system you could do mediation, because a law provides for what should happen. And my view has always been that mediation has a role, because often it's the lack of a principled resolution is a misunderstanding of what the circumstances actually are. And in getting the stories out and in getting people to think about their positions, often the real facts get better established, and you can find a resolution within the parameters of the law, or the rules, as I'll just call them, the rules, which, when you speak about law, everybody sees that who ministers these things as fixed, and yet when you sit and make decisions based on law as a trier of some cases, it's totally a different viewpoint. That really what you hear and what comes out even in a typical trial tends to move what happens. And so I don't see why mediation could not work.
Interesting. Wonderful. Well, thank you. That gives me a place to start some of my better than the all of the answers I was getting from tax litigators, which was like, no, of course not. And the 2 papers that are out there that that are like, no, of course not. That's great. Thank you.